Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 23. Very soon after the firing started, most of the shells were landing forward in the ship, where fires raged and huge pieces of iron and steel flew through the air. Bismarck was jolted particularly hard when, shortly after 0900, her four turrets, forward fire control station and tower mast were hit. A little later, somewhat aft, a heavy shell went right through the superstructure deck in way of the aircraft catapult. The protected space it landed in was used for storing ready ammunition for the 105mm guns, which blew up, killing the crews of the heavy anti-aircraft guns who were taking shelter there. Around 0940, the back wall of turret Bruno, whose guns had jammed in a position pointing athwartships, was blown off and the turret was on fire. Shortly before the British ship stopped firing, bright flames burned briefly around turret Anton. As a member of the ammunition handling group assigned to the aft anti-aircraft control station for the heavy flak, Musikmat Josef Mahlberg was stationed in a powder chamber in Compartment 9. When the fight had been going on for some time, the door to the chamber opened and in stepped Bootsmann Rolf Franke of the aft anti-aircraft computer room. He had a strange expression on his face. Mahlberg knew him well, the two of them always went most of the way to their stations together. Franke cried out. "The words just come through. Abandon ship. The ship's going to be scuttled." Dropping everything, Mahlberg and his men scrambled to go through the auxiliary shell hoists to the superstructure. When that proved impossible, they turned back and went through the bulkhead door to the decks where, in contrast to their well-lit chamber, they were in darkness and soon lost sight of one another. Only flashlights made pools of light here and there. Mahlberg's first stop was the battery deck in Compartment 10, where hundreds of men were jostling one another in an effort to get to the upper deck. Suddenly, we heard the familiar voice of the first officer, sharp and incisive. "What's all this? Go forward and help put out the fire. We aren't lost yet, not by a long shot. Is there no officer here who can take command?" But none came forward. Whatever happened, Mahlberg somehow reached the starboard upper deck in the neighborhood of the aircraft crane. Only then did he fully grasp our plight. All that was left of the once proud ship was ruin. He tried to get to the forecastle, but water flowing over the deck near the middle 15cm turret blocked his way. He turned back towards the quarterdeck, and when he passed turret Dora, he saw some of its badly burned crew sitting or lying on the upper deck. Because the quarterdeck was already partly underwater, Mahlberg climbed up to the roof of the turret. "Just look at what's happened to my turret," Oberstückmeister Friedrich Alfred Schubert, one of the burned men, called to him. "Get away! It's going to blow up at any minute!" Mahlberg turned and went back to the main deck. In the starboard turbine room, Maschinenmat Wilhelm Generotzky was aware that our own guns were firing very irregularly and that we were being hit again and again, but not a single shell penetrated his area or anywhere else below the armored deck. He felt very proud of German naval architecture and German workmanship. He and his men had no idea what the upper decks looked like, but they could not fail to think that the end was at hand. Bismarck seemed to have been transformed into a practice target for the enemy. The second mate of his watch, his face chalk white, called to him in passing. "It's over! It's all over!" He knew the young mate well, knew he was happily married. From the ventilator shafts that led to the diesel engines, there came a sound like peas dancing on a drum. It was shell splinters falling on the main deck. A highly excited stoker came in and yelled, "Herr Maschinenmat, transformer room number 1 is on fire. You must go below." Generotzky put on his respirator, grabbed a fire extinguisher and tumbled down the companionway. Below, he carefully opened the door to the transformer room. Nothing. Neither fire nor smoke greeted him. He went on to the door to the diesel room, but all was clear here too. Still, while he was climbing down, he thought he smelled smoke. Where was it coming from? He checked all the spaces near the companionway and, as he opened the door to a 105mm shell and powder chamber, acrid yellow fumes assailed him and he saw a reddish glare. Quick as a flash, he closed the door and rushed back up on deck to where the flood control valves were mounted on a bulkhead. Oh God, how long it took, half a turn one way, half the other way, and beneath him the burning ammunition. At last, it opened. Quickly, open the seacocks and start the pumps. Open the flood control valve a little more. Hold it, that won't work. Too much water pressure on the valve. Shut off the pumps, open the valve, let the pumps run again, and water was beginning to cover the burning ammunition. His hands were shaking, his knees trembling, and sweat was pouring down his face. Just as he was making his report to his section officer, his division officer came from the engine control station and gave orders to flood the rooms in flood group number 4. But at the same moment, a petty officer from damage control team number 4 reported that rooms in flood groups number 4 and 5 were already flooded. There had been fires in several ammunition chambers. Generotzky and his men did not know that all the 105mm guns had been demolished or had their turrets shot away. They were also not aware that some of the 15cm turrets had been hit and their armor penetrated on the port side by fragments or direct hits. When abandoned ship was ordered, Generotzky climbed to compartment 10 of the battery deck, where some 60 men were already waiting to use the companionway to the upper deck. Hits landing above were clearly audible. In the passageway stood the first officer and the commander of Division 11, Kapitänleutnant Albert Hasselmeier. Fregattenkapitän Oels said, "Don't go up there, it would be certain death. Better go to the forecastle and help put out the fires." But that didn't make any sense. Fuses had been set and the scuttling charges would go off at any moment. Generotzky was standing about 5 meters from the companionway with a wall of waiting comrades ahead of him. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, a rumbling roar, and he was thrown into the air, landing hard on his back. A shell had hit the companionway. Men stumbled over him, one helped him up, and they both ran aft to compartment 8, where the companionway to the upper deck was a mass of men. Maschinenmat Heinrich König unloaded the ammunition hoist from the trunk in the adjacent 105mm shell and powder chamber, the one that Generotzky had flooded a few minutes earlier, so that it could be used to escape. 40 men, one behind the other, began to climb up the narrow shaft, only 50 centimeters wide. The lights had gone out and some of them held their flashlights in their mouth. Everyone waited his turn patiently. There was no pushing, no jostling. Each man was lifted by the ones behind so that he could grab the first rung of the ladder. Muffled explosions below encouraged them to make the greatest possible haste. Finally, Generotzky's turn came. He was pushed up into the duct and, rung by rung, he pulled himself upwards. When he got a hold on the upper deck, his hands were in a pool of blood. He stood up inside the demolished superstructure and found himself surrounded by dead bodies, 3 or 4 deep, lying where they had fallen. But he was out of the frightening coffin Bismarck had become. At least there was light up there, and the white caps on the water showed that there was life. The enemy was still firing, adding to the chaos, as corpses piled on top of one another. He made for the hangar where, although it had a huge hole in one side, he hoped to find shelter. But when he got there, he shrank back. Too many had already tried to find shelter there, but in vain. He jumped down to the upper deck and ran aft, but so much water was already washing over it that he clambered back up. At last, the firing ceased. On his way up from below deck, Maschinengefreiter Bruno Zickelbein of Damage Control Team No. 6 saw the first officer in compartment 13 on the battery deck. "Comrades," Oels was shouting, "we can no longer fire our guns, and anyway, we have no more ammunition. Our hour has come, we must abandon ship. She will be scuttled, all hands to the upper deck." Oels then led Zickelbein and 7 other men aft to compartment 9 and told them to carry 4 wounded men who were waiting there to the main deck. Carrying their burdens, the men went to the only companionway they could get up, the one near the catapult amidships. When Zickelbein and his partner were halfway up with their load, a shell struck and hurled them back to the battery deck. Another hit killed the wounded and a number of other men. Now, the companionway was wrecked and, through a huge hole in the battery deck, Zickelbein could see all the way down to the main deck. "Everyone here is dead," Maschinenmat Erich Vogel told him. "We are the only ones alive." They gave up trying to get to the upper deck and went to compartment 10. Then came the order. "Maschinenmat Silberling and his party report to the engine control station immediately." Hans Silberling gave Zickelbein his hand and said, "We won't see each other again, this is the end. Say hello at home for me." They clasped hands for a moment, and tears ran down their cheeks. Zickelbein was barely 19 years old, and the 25-year-old Silberling had been a kind of fatherly friend to him. But there was nothing for it, and Silberling carried out his last order. There were more hits, and the lights went out. Holding handkerchiefs over their mouths and noses to protect themselves from the dense smoke, Zickelbein and his companions tried to get to the upper deck by way of the companionway near the enlisted men's mess. While they were waiting for wounded men to be carried up, they heard Marinestabsarzt Arvid Thiele say, Leave 'em. They'll sleep better here." Everyone knew what he meant. Hardly had the doctor spoken when a shell smashed the mass companionway, killing those closest to it. Fearing that none of the companionways forward was usable, the surviving men tried to climb the shattered one. So much water was pouring in from above that by the time Zickelbein reached it, he was standing in water higher than his waist. Eventually, he too escaped. In Power Plant number 2 in Compartment 8 of the lower platform deck, Maschinenobergefreiter Hans Springborn gave the generators and the diesel engines a final inspection shortly before the scuttling charges went off. He wanted to ensure that there would be light right up to the end, and there was. Topside, Bismarck looked like a heap of scrap metal, all on fire. Men were running back and forth, trying to find a way of saving themselves. However, the ship's boats, life preservers and floats had all been long since destroyed. Amid all the devastation on the main deck, Springborn saw wounded men lying on stretchers. They were supposed to have been carried to the dressing station below, but because the continuing fall of shells made this impossible, the doctors were scurrying around, giving them sedatives. Maschinengefreiter Hermann Budich, the runner in Action Station E in Compartment 9 of the lower platform deck, who around midnight had taken Maschinengefreiter Gerhard Böhnel's telephone report that the starboard rudder had at last been uncoupled, was wounded and brought to the action dressing station aft. Since he was not seriously hurt, he was laid on the deck outside. He had just heard one of the doctors say, "Only serious cases inside," when there was a frightful crash. A direct hit on the dressing station. Inside it, nothing stirred anymore. It must have been between 0910 and 0915 that the mission Oels and Diaries had been performing came to an end. The destruction on board and the growing mass of water in the ship made it senseless to record hits and try to limit their effects. The opposite had to be done, to destroy what could no longer be saved. Since 0915 at the latest, Bismarck had been mortally wounded, losses and lack of ammunition had signaled the end. Now the two officers had to supervise the scuttling of the ship and devise ways for the men to get through the chaos of the main and battery decks to safety. "Scuttling procedure, everyone overboard," Oels ordered, and the transmission of this order to all stations was the last action of the personnel in the damage control center. That being done, they formed a line to go through a bulkhead and then into the communications shaft, which led vertically upwards and opened into the forward conning tower above the ship's bridge. "Come along!" Sagner summoned Maschinengast Statz, but the latter answered, "No, I'm staying here." Why he said that, he doesn't know himself, probably out of fear, for the crackling of the hits outside was undiminished. Diaries looked at Statz in surprise, shot his hand to his cap by way of farewell, and entered the connecting shaft. Oels went through the port bulkhead towards the stern, shouting as he went out, "We have 9 or 10 minutes time." Followed by some of the men from his command center, Oels passed through compartments 13 and 10 on the battery deck where, as we know, he met Zickelbein, Mahlberg and Generotzky, to compartment 8 of his deck. There he found a surging mass of some 300 men pushing and shoving towards the ladders. Acrid yellowish-green smoke swirled across the deck, and the men who didn't have gas masks were racked by choking coughs. The hatch at the top of one ladder was jammed halfway open. Get out! Get out!" called Oels in an emotional, crackling voice. "Everyone off the ship! She's being scuttled! You can't get through forward! Everything is burning forward!" The words were barely out of his mouth when a green flash whizzed by, burst into a fireball and exploded with a deafening crash. Men reeled, were hurled through the air and fell hard on the deck. More than 100 were killed in an instant, Oels among them. He was standing between the mess hall and the companionway when the shell struck. The groans and whimpers of the wounded arose from every direction. In the damage control center, Statz remained standing at the table. His glance fell on the damage control board, which mercilessly revealed the bad situation of his ship. Red, the color for taking water, covered almost the entire port side. Green, for flooded, showed that the port shell and powder chambers and nearly the entire starboard side, the outboard list control tanks there, had been filled for a long time. White, indicating pumped, was lit up only for the engine rooms below the armored deck. First, Statz emptied his pockets. There was an order about this, laid aside his machinist's action tool belt and his machinist's action hammer, which the men had christened Unak's action hammer after its designer. Unak was truly the father of damage control measures in Bismarck, which, as Statz was reminding himself at this moment, made Junak's sudden transfer shortly before sailing to the post of turbine engineer in exchange for Diaries all the more inexplicable. Then Statz put on his life jacket, unfastened of course, but what to do next? Statz was now completely alone in the command center. The electric light was burning as though nothing had happened. Nervousness gripped him. Should he? Would he go aft as Oels had indicated? He tried it and stepped through the bulkhead out of the center, but he didn't get much farther. Pitch-black darkness and thick smoke made it impossible for him to see anything, and soon he was standing in knee-deep water on the upper platform deck on the heavily listing ship. He stopped near the flood valves for the 15-centimeter munitions chambers. To think that barely 30 minutes earlier he and Sagner had opened them. The chambers had shown external temperatures of 80 degrees centigrade, and Sagner ordered for them all to be flooded. Statz objected, but there were still people in there. Yet after the chamber bulkheads could not be opened, Sagner stood firm. For the Führer, Volk and Fatherland, it's got to be done, otherwise we'll all go sky high. My God, flashed through his head. Are we really going to go sky high now? Better get away from here anyway, back to the familiar control center. Once again Statz was alone in his still well-lit, accustomed surroundings, which he should have left long ago, but in this almost incredible fashion could not. While he was considering what to do, the damage control telephone shrilled in the silence. Who could still be calling now? Heavens, still now after such an inferno, thought Statz. He picked up the receiver and heard my question from the aft fire control station. Who has and where is the command of the ship? Are there new orders in effect? With Oels' last words spinning around in his head that barely 10 minutes remained for the crew to save themselves, how many of them had already elapsed? And thoroughly perplexed as he was, Statz pulled himself together and replied quickly and tersely, First officer and damage control officer have left the control center together with the compartment personnel. I must now follow. And from my call he realized, someone's still alive up there. There's still hope, but now I've got to get out of here. Fast. Hardly had he hung up the receiver, then suddenly 2 men entered the compartment. Maschinenobergefreiter Heinz Moritz and Erich Seifert, his messmate Fietje. 2 old-timers from the building course who knew every nook and cranny of the ship. They had found their way from aft to the connecting shaft to the forward conning tower. But as Fietje, once so full of good advice, stood there barefoot, wearing only an undershirt, he had nothing at all to say and only stared at Statz without showing any sort of reaction. Turning to Moritz, Statz asked, should we try to go up 7 decks through the cable shaft or communications tube and then 4 more below from there to the upper deck? He had only a hazy recollection of that route. By way of answer, Fietje stepped smartly into the shaft, Moritz followed, and Statz came last. Inside the narrow communications tube, the ascent was a true ordeal for the 3 men. The iron rungs were welded to the starboard side, but for some time Bismarck had had a steadily increasing list to port, so that the men, hanging onto the rungs on the opposite side and repeatedly snagged by cable housings, had to expend 3 times the usual amount of energy to clamber up. This difficult climb, the hellish circumstances and the worry constricting his throat as to how all of this would end completely, confused Statz. Every time he glanced up past the men above him and saw light, he asked himself, is that the sky or is it water? The higher he went, with the continuous battle noises becoming ever more ear-splitting, the light ever brighter just where the forward conning tower should have cast everything in darkness, it became all the more clear to him that something must have happened to the conning tower. And in fact, on climbing out of the shaft, Statz found himself in the open, with apparently nothing left standing above the platform there. Another direct hit struck the conning tower, demolishing its remains and spewing scraps of metal overboard. Now, only the outline of the conning tower could very faintly be discerned in the short segments of upright armor plate on the deck. That was all. Its destruction had meant death for the many officers massed at their action stations there. They lay in their blue uniforms. Statz recognized Diaries and Sagner, who had come from below shortly before, saw them not far from the mouth of the shaft, both dead, and thought, honor to their memories. The last direct hit had also wounded Moritz, Seifert and Statz, the latter with a 20-centimeter long gash in his left shoulder. Luckily, he was wearing leather clothing, the other 2 were not. Amid the clawing shell splinters, he could only roll out of the shaft, and as he did so, heard the familiar Rhenish voice of his friend Oberleutnant Kardinal. Well, friend, did they get you? My God, he thought, someone is still alive up here too. Then they were standing beside one another, Statz and Cardinal, just the two of them, for no one else was on his feet anywhere within their field of vision. It would have been impossible for the situation to have corresponded more completely to the battle problem at sea of Rotenhafen a month earlier. "Half bad with my wound," he told Cardinal, "but we must get below as quickly as we can." Then he saw Moritz lying terribly wounded on the deck with his whole chest torn open, and Statz and Cardinal pulled him gently behind the armored bridge bulwark, the only part of the ship that was still intact here above. How he could help his comrade, Statz was too excited to have any idea and simply stroked his face as one would a baby's. But Moritz smiled at him gratefully, gasped, "Say hello to Cologne for me," and died. The tragedy continues with these 7 survivor accounts from various parts of the ship telling harrowing stories of death and destruction, but also about survival. It is almost unimaginable how anybody escaped at all from the now burning hunk of metal. But I find it extremely interesting how some of them, even after it is clear that everything is lost, still flood ammunition storage rooms to prevent serious detonations. To put it in their words, honor to their memory. The reports from all over the ship will continue in the next episode, and I will see you then. Cheers and bye bye.